Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Hi, Mouin. Thank you for joining me again.
Hi, Nassim. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Likewise, I want to begin this week with the situation in northern Gaza, where there's been no food or aid that's been allowed to enter into northern Gaza for nearly 2 weeks, according to reports. And then moved to a report by the United Nations concluding that Israel has executed an extermination campaign in Gaza. And then we'll move to some of the other regional issues in Lebanon, Iran, and also US and Germany. But let's begin, as I said, with the situation in northern Gaza. As reported, no food has entered northern Gaza for nearly 2 weeks. Netanyahu is seeking to seal the area of all humanitarian aid. Uh, this morning, an Israeli airstrike on a hospital. Um, we saw the images come out from that. Patients being burnt alive, patients connected to IV or what may have been life support machine, who knows? UNRWA school was hit also over the weekend, and a report has come out estimating that a UN report estimating that 400,000 people are trapped by the latest assault on northern Gaza. And another horrific milestone as well from the UN, reported by the UN in Gaza. Gaza is now home to the largest cohort of child amputees in modern history. So that's the latest on the list of many horrific milestones that has been reached on Gaza. But let's just get your thoughts on what's been happening in northern Gaza over the last couple
Sure.
of days.
Well, let me just start with a slight correction, which is these horrific images of patients being burned alive in their beds in a hospital compound that you're referring to from last night. That actually was in Deir el-Balah at the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital, and that's in the central Gaza Strip and not in the northern Gaza Strip that you asked me about. And I'll explain in a moment why that's important in understanding the situation in the northern Gaza Strip. What we're seeing in the northern Gaza Strip is the implementation of an initiative that's widely known as the General's Plan. Its chief progenitor is a retired senior Israeli military officer named Giora Eiland, who was also national security advisor when Ariel Sharon, of Sabra Shatila fame, among others, was prime minister. And he has, since last October, been publishing a regular column in the leading Israeli newspaper, Yediot Ahronot, in which he's constantly advocating for humanitarian catastrophe. He, for example, advocated creating the conditions for epidemic disease in the southern Gaza Strip because he said, this would make it easier for for Israel's soldiers to fight and take fewer losses. Profile and courage if there ever was one. And he's been advocating mass starvation. He's used the word humanitarian catastrophe and governmental collapse as objectives that Israel should be striving for. Of course, he's far from the only one, but he has been saying the quiet part out loud more than most. Now, what's happened in the northern Gaza Strip is not only that the Qassam brigades, the military wing of the Hamas movement, in addition to other armed groups, still have an active presence there. But just as, if not more importantly, from Israel's point of view, um, Hamas has resumed the governmental functions. In other words, it's involved in aid distribution, it's involved in maintaining law and order, and these kinds of basic functions that one would expect from any government. Now, what the general's plan proposes and advocates is that Israel should comprehensively um, prohibit the entry of any humanitarian supplies whatsoever to the Gaza Strip. We're talking about food, we're talking about water, electricity, medical supplies, all of it. Very similar to what was enunciated so clearly by so many Israeli leaders in October of last year. And then it should give the remaining population in this region of the Gaza Strip, which, as you know, the UN has estimated at around 400,000 people, it should give them 10 days to leave that region through designated safe routes to a so-called humanitarian zone farther south. Once this has happened, any who don't evacuate, any who don't accept being forcibly displaced, if you will be considered Hamas and therefore legitimate military targets. In other words, impose a comprehensive siege, expel the population, and then kill anything that remains. So the first question is, why are there still 400,000 Palestinians, according to these estimates, in the northern Gaza Strip? Well, this bombing you talked about is a very important part of the explanation. First of all, over the past year, we have repeatedly seen Palestinian civilians get shot, bombed, killed by snipers as they are leaving their areas of residence on these so-called designated safe routes. And secondly, once they arrive to these so-called humanitarian zones, they're repeatedly bombed and, as in yesterday, burned alive in their tents and in their hospital beds. So, regarding the population that's remained in the northern Gaza Strip, some have refused to leave. Others have seen no advantage in moving to different zones, which are neither humanitarian nor safe zones. And others are simply too frightened to make the journey, given what's happened to those who have done it previously. So, what we're seeing now is a comprehensive Israeli siege preventing the entry of any humanitarian supplies, and in addition, targeting facilities that already exist in this, bombing the only remaining bakery, um, earlier today, bombing a flour distribution center and killing people who were there to collect. And of course, every time Israel does perpetrates one of these atrocities, it puts out a statement saying this was Hamas. And for Israel's sponsors and allies in the West, that's all they need. That's the fig leaf they require. But I think what's we've now, this is becoming so transparently a war of annihilation. And what strikes me is that as Israel's atrocities get ever more depraved, it's not concocting more persuasive pretexts for its slaughter. It's either putting out a statement that just mentions Hamas, or it's putting out no statement at all. In other words, these atrocities have become completely normalized, not only for Israel and Israeli society, but just as importantly for Israel's sponsors and enablers in the West, who no longer even require one of these pro forma statements that we were bombing Hamas command center, whatever. So and what that means, I think, is that this is going to intensify and continue to get worse. The other thing the Israelis have done is they have surrounded Jabalia refugee camp, and then they have also sought to occupy a corridor to separate the northern part of this region, Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia, and others, from the southern part. In other words, compartmentalizing it. And they've carried out, once again, a campaign of systematic destruction of anything that's still standing in these areas and reducing them to rubble. Of course, we hear the occasional statement of concern, but when you're providing Israel with weapons and diplomatic support and so on, any statement of concern is entirely meaningless and is meant as a cover up rather than an admonition.
Of course, the strike in the hospital yesterday is part of what is now a clear pattern that began last October. And this week we will be marking the strike on Al Ahli Arab Hospital on October 17, 2000, last year, killing 471 Palestinians. And if we recall how the US and Britain and other allies leapt to Israel's defense, saying that no, it wasn't Israel, it was a misfired Hamas rocket attacks. Those claims were debunked by many organizations, key amongst them being forensic architecture. They did a analysis and found that no, it wasn't misfired Hamas rocket attack, but it was actually an Israeli strike. And many of us suspected that it was an Israeli strike, and we actually spoke about that in length in one of our shows earlier. I mentioned this because the UN has produced a report which further confirms that, to me anyway, that the attack on Al Ahli Hospital was the beginning of a systematic destruction of Gaza's healthcare system. And that is exactly the conclusion of the UN report, a report by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem. So do you want to speak on some of the key findings and just how condemning it is, how the conclusion that Israel has decimated and destroyed Gaza's healthcare system?
Yeah. Yes, this report by the independent UN Commission, it's a permanent commission established by the United Nations Human Rights Council, which interestingly has as a mandate to examine not only the situation in the territories occupied by Israel in 1967, but also within Israel itself. And this is one of its periodic reports in which it looks at a number of issues. It looks at conduct by not only Israel, but also by Hamas. But I think the core finding of this report, and to me the most compelling one, is that it looks at all these numerous incidents of Israeli attacks on the healthcare infrastructure, on medical workers, on ambulances, and so on, and basically takes apart the Israeli claim that what it was doing was attacking Hamas, and that these medical facilities got in the way because they were being used as human shields, as safe zones or whatever by Palestinian militants. What it demonstrates, and I think conclusively so, and it states so explicitly, is that what we've experienced during the past year is a deliberate, premeditated Israeli campaign to destroy the Palestinian health infrastructure. Again, for the reasons of making the Gaza Strip unfit for human habitation. The attack on the Al Ahli Baptist Hospital that you mentioned is absolutely central to this story, because this was the first major bombing of a Palestinian hospital. And as Israel often does in such cases, it doesn't just go all in and basically bomb every Palestinian hospital in the Gaza Strip in the space of an hour. Rather, what it does is it conducts one act, the bombing of this hospital. Then it looks at how the international community, and particularly its Western sponsors and enablers, react. Will they and their media amplify its claims, its false narratives that Israel had nothing to do with this attack, that it was in fact a misdirected Palestinian missile, which they then interpret as a license to kill and as a license to proceed further. And that's exactly what happened. As you've mentioned, numerous people who have looked into this in much detail have concluded that it was indisputably an Israeli missile attack on this Palestinian hospital. It's also what Palestinian medics and foreign volunteers on scene have concluded. There is a very detailed two-part report on this attack that takes a very technical scientific approach by Maher Arrar, which reaches the same conclusion. But, Israel attacked this hospital, murdered lots of people. Many people say not despite this hospital having organic ties to the Anglican Church. But because of that, because the idea was if we can get away with targeting this hospital, despite its prominent international connections, then we can do whatever the hell we please. And indeed, it started putting out the story that it was in fact not an Israeli missile. This despite Israel having bombed just outside the hospital previously and having warned the medical staff they need to immediately evacuate. But rather, they said it was a errant Palestinian missile. The message was adopted and amplified wholesale by leaders and politicians in Washington, in London, in Brussels, in Berlin, and elsewhere. That message was adopted and amplified by Israel's key allies in the media, BBC, CNN, New York Times, and all its other stenographers. And pretty soon, this went down in history as a Palestinian attack on Al Ahli Hospital rather than a deliberate and premeditated Israeli attack on this Palestinian hospital. But to get back to the point, and I'm sorry for the long digression, once Israel recognized that it could attack Palestinian hospitals without consequence and that its impunity would be basically unaffected by this. It then began what the commission describes as a systematic campaign to eliminate the Palestinian health infrastructure. And it gives very detailed reports of, all the attacks on hospitals, on ambulances, on medical workers, and so on. And it also makes the point that it has received no evidence of that substantiate any of Israel's claims regarding Hamas or other Palestinian armed groups allegedly using these facilities as military bases. I think it refers to one case where a firefight took place within the grounds of Al Shifa Hospital when it was invaded by Israeli troops for the second time. But these fantastic videos that we were fed by the Israeli military about a Palestinian Pentagon under Al Shifa Hospital, which of course was amplified by Israel's allies and stenographers in the media. None of that is substantiated. So it's a very damning report. And especially when it's now so abundantly clear that what we're looking at is a war of annihilation. In that context, this systematic, premeditated campaign against the Palestinian health system and the Palestinian health infrastructure begins to make perfect sense. If I could just add one point, this week, the World Health Organization, I believe it was, announced that the second round of polio vaccinations would be conducted in the Gaza Strip. Quite apart from the fact that Israel yesterday also bombed one of the facilities where such vaccinations would be given, I believe in Nusayrat refugee camp in the central Gaza Strip, what it demonstrates very clearly is that when Israel wants a certain public health initiative to take place, all of a sudden all its pretexts and excuses about Hamas command centers, Hamas commanders, and all the rest of it evaporate into thin air. Why? Well, because a polio epidemic presents a threat not only to the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, but equally to Israelis within Israel, and particularly because you have certain sectors of Israel's Jewish population that don't inoculate their children. So all of a sudden, it became an Israeli public health emergency as well. And lo and behold, all of Israel's pretexts and objectives vanished into thin air. And all of a sudden, the WHO and UNRWA and others were able to conduct this widespread vaccination campaign.
I wanted to pick up on the point you made about the response by the West following the strike on Al Ahli Hospital and how the Brits and the Americans provided justification and explanation, and they conducted, as they say, an investigation and concluded it wasn't Israel. And for people like you and me and others who saw that defense, we thought, this is probably the beginning of really the war of annihilation, because how could they have reached that conclusion based on what we saw? There was nowhere, they didn't put anyone on the ground to investigate, but what was clear was that the level of destruction that was caused clearly required a type of weapon which only Israel in the region possessed. But be that as it may, we're now a year on, and what we are seeing, according to most analysts, is that the war of annihilation has now been moved to Lebanon. And this weekend, over the weekend, a mosque was struck amongst schools and many other residential areas, including areas, neighborhoods where Hezbollah does not reside. So, do you think now it's there's no doubt that Israel is imposing a war of annihilation, or the Gaza doctrine, if you want to call it, targeting civilians, residential areas, and decimating and flattening the whole of southern Lebanon?
Well, when Israel's campaign against the Gaza Strip first started, many people referred to the Dahya Doctrine. And the Dahya Doctrine was enunciated, I believe, in 2008 by a former Israeli general. He may have been chief of staff, I'm not sure on that point,
Mm,
Gadi Eisenkot, which Dahya refers to the southern suburbs of Beirut, in which Eisenkot was making the point that in any future conflict, Israel would not only seek to target its military adversaries, but engage in a campaign of premeditated, disproportionate violence unleashed against civilians and civilian infrastructure for two purposes, both because, in Eisenkot's belief, this would enhance Israel's powers of deterrence against whatever enemy it was fighting and anyone who was watching. And secondly, because it would also, in Israel's view, help turn its military adversaries' constituents against that enemy by imposing an unbearable degree of suffering on the civilian population. But, we have to recognize that the Dahya Doctrine actually goes back to the 1940s. The strategy of attacking not only the military adversary, but also the civilian environment which sustains it. We've seen this throughout Israel's wars. We saw, for example, very clearly in 1982 in Lebanon, in the late 1960s in the Jordan Valley, in the 1970s in southern Lebanon, and so on. So Israel has always had a strategy of purposefully targeting civilians for political reasons. In other words, to impose unbearable costs and suffering on them in order to turn them against its military adversaries. It's kind of the textbook definition of terrorism, in this case, state terrorism. But so when Israel last October first began its campaign against the Gaza Strip, and we saw, apartment buildings being pulverized and so on, people spoke about the Dahya Doctrine. But given what we've seen during the past year in the Gaza Strip, when Israel is now returning to the southern suburbs of Beirut and reducing it to rubble and reducing border villages in southern Lebanon to rubble, carrying out huge amounts of massive air raids in the Bekaa Valley and in other areas, we're no longer speaking about the Dahya Doctrine. It's now become the Gaza Doctrine. And the Gaza Doctrine goes beyond its predecessor in the sense that it's not only a deliberate and premeditated attack against the civilian population and civilian infrastructure with the purpose of turning them against the armed groups that Israel is seeking to eradicate, but it's a doctrine of total destruction, of we've all seen these videos of Israelis blowing up universities and residential blocks and schools and so on, and celebrating them and dedicating them to their wives and girlfriends and young children and so on. Well, it's this kind of maniacal, genocidal mentality that basically says, in order to deter you, we will annihilate you if that's what it takes. In order to deter anyone who's watching, we will annihilate an entire territory and make it unfit for human habitation. And that is the Gaza doctrine that is currently being applied to growing to parts of Lebanon.
On sticking with Lebanon, I wanted to ask you about the attack on UN peacekeepers. I think Netanyahu definitely, in his statement, issued what many believed is a threat to the UN peacekeepers. Peacekeepers have been injured. Irish peacekeepers, in particular, have become heroes in many people's eyes. If you follow the story on social media, refusing to leave. And it's also worth pointing out, in the context of Lebanon, the strike by Hezbollah on Israeli military base, killing, I think, four or five and injuring something like 60. And as many have pointed out, Hezbollah, who is, according to the US and others, is a terrorist organization, struck an Israeli military base, whereas Israel, who is an ally armed by the West and the US and Britain and everyone else, is targeting civilians, targeting hospitals, targeting schools, and behaving like a terrorist. So I thought I'd mention that and then get your thoughts on first, your comment, first description who the UN peacekeepers are, what their role is, and the assault and the attack they've come under from Israeli forces.
Mhm. Well, yeah, just on your last point, again, state terrorism has always been integral to Israeli military strategy and Israel's approach to deterring not only those within its borders, but also those in the region who might have ideas about resisting Israeli hegemony. Regarding UNIFIL, UNIFIL stands for United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon. It was established in 1978. In 1978, Israel launched its first invasion of Lebanon, and the United Nations Security Council at the time, with the support of the Americans, I should add, passed Resolution 425, which demanded an immediate Israeli withdrawal from sovereign Lebanese territory. Of course, Israel didn't leave Lebanon until not it didn't leave in 1978. It didn't leave until 2000, and when it left, it had nothing to do with the will of the international community or Security Council. It was because they were expelled from Lebanon by Hezbollah. I'll get to that part later. So the as part of United Nations Security Council Resolution 425 of 1978, which demanded an immediate and unconditional Israeli withdrawal from Lebanese territory. This was at a time where the Palestine Liberation Organization had a strong presence in southern Lebanon. Resolution 425 also established this peacekeeping force, UNIFIL, and its purpose was twofold. Initially, it was to monitor Israel's withdrawal from Lebanon, and it was to assist the Lebanese government in establishing its authority on the Lebanese side of the border. And I believe it also had a mandate to prevent violations of Lebanese sovereignty or attacks on civilians. I'm fairly certain, but not entirely certain on that point. At the time, many people were surprised that the PLO, which was the actual force, the primary force in southern Lebanon, agreed to this agree to this resolution. And the reason it later emerged is that the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat and others in the Palestinian leadership had absolutely no illusions about what UNIFIL could and could not achieve. But they believed that if you had this force basically sitting on the Israeli-Lebanese border, and you had numerous countries, Europeans, Canadians, countries from all over Asia, Africans, Latin America. If you had this kind of multinational force sitting on the Israeli-Lebanese border and observing reality for a period of 1, 2, 3 years, um, the PLO believed that many of these soldiers, when they then returned to their home countries, would be so impressed in a negative way by observing firsthand how Israel conducts itself that they would become advocates for the Palestinian cause simply by experiencing reality in the Middle East. And by and large, that paid off because many former UNIFIL soldiers in Europe, in Asia, and elsewhere have become prominent advocates for Palestinian rights and prominent critics of Israel and its methods of dealing with the Palestinians and Arabs in the region because they've seen and experienced it firsthand. So then, for example, in 1982, um, when Israel launched its second invasion of Lebanon, it just swept UNIFIL forces aside on its march to Beirut. And most recently, in 2006, during the Israeli-Hezbollah war that was brought to an end by Security Council Resolution 1701, UNIFIL's mandate was expanded again. And I believe at that point, two clauses were added. One was to prevent the insertion of any armed force other than the Lebanese army from establishing a presence on the Lebanese side of the border. And I believe it also had another clause, again, emphasizing its role in defending civilians from attack. Of course, UNIFIL also keeps statistics. And if you look at the violations of its mandate by Israel on the one hand versus Palestinians and Lebanese on the other, there is absolutely no comparison. For example, Israeli violations of Lebanese airspace have been a daily occurrence since 1978, usually occurring several times a day. And so that's kind of the background to UNIFIL. It's Israel likes to view UNIFIL as an auxiliary to the Israeli army. In other words, that Israel will tell UNIFIL what to do, and it's UNIFIL's responsibility to do it. UNIFIL has created some level of suspicion and hostility in the border communities, both among the population and among Hezbollah. But on the whole, I think the Lebanese and Palestinians have maintained a productive relationship with UNIFIL as opposed to Israel, which has been on the whole, demonizing it for basically not acting as a unit of the Israeli military.
Sticking with the United Nations, 104 UN member states, including the African Union, have expressed support for Antonio Gutierrez, who was made by Israel persona non grata following, I think it was last week or the week before. So it doesn't. Um, you can guess that the US, UK, and many of its allies have not supported that. So I wanted to ask you really generally that this is a consistent attack on the UN and the undermining of the UN. And some commentators have said that the US and its allies have reached a conclusion that the rules-based system does not serve their interest, and 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 they need to reconfigure the whole system, and in a way which allows them and Israel to fight wars of genocide, wars which turn whole nations and countries into rubble. So that's an analysis some have made, and you can see why they would make that analysis because time after time, the US has supported Israel, it's attacked the UN, and this was like one of the major assault and undermining the credibility of the United Nations, which was the attack on Antonio Gutierrez. Now, 104 countries have come out in support of him. So what are your comments on that? And generally, the analysis some have made that the US does not see the rules-based system as serving its interest anymore. It wants to change the system by undermining the very institutions that are there to defend those the rights and security and safety, which people have grown used to in this post-Second World War II period.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a very important point. US and UK, and in some sense more broadly, Western frustrations with the international system that was put in place at the conclusion of the Second World War to prevent a repeat of what happened during the first half of the 20th century. That frustration has been evident for some time. It came very clearly to the fore in 2003 with US and British frustration that they couldn't just go their merry way in illegally invading and occupying and dismantling the Iraqi state. But I think the difference is that we've now come to a fork in the road. Given everything that Israel has been doing during the past year in Gaza, and the absolute silence, well, it hasn't been silence, it's been active support of the US and Israel sponsors and enablers. We've now come to a fork in the road. In other words, we've now come to a point where we've now come to the point where we must make one of only two available choices. We either restore the international system, its rules, its principles, and its values as these have existed since 1945 by beginning to enforce them, or we sacrifice those on the altar of Israeli impunity, because you can't have it both ways. You either have a rules-based international order, or you have Israeli impunity, in which even the rules-based international order, as defined by the West, which is that its enemies and adversaries need to strictly observe the rules, but we and our friends can ignore them, even that will collapse. And I have to say, you know, I think Guterres and certainly Western states bear quite a bit of responsibility for this, not only in insisting on Israeli impunity as a foundational principle of the international order, but look at what's happened in the past year. The Israeli permanent representative to the United Nations gets up in front of the General Assembly and publicly
Where's his
shreds.
finger like this
Yeah,
constantly?
yes, the UN Charter. He literally took a copy of the United Nations Charter and put it into a shredder on the podium of the UN General Assembly. What was the response? Nothing to see here. Um, Israel condemns and slanders Guterres as an anti-Semite. What's his response? Really nothing. It's not only Israel's conduct in the Gaza Strip, it's Israel's conduct within the UN itself. Israel um, uh, defines UNRWA as a terrorist organization and has passed legislation to basically confiscate its headquarters in Jerusalem and turn this into a Jewish settlement? And there's almost no response. So we're seeing a two-pronged attack on the Palestinians, of course, but also a direct frontal Israeli attack on the UN, on its institutions, on its principles and charter, which has received no significant pushback from Western states. Even those who have criticized Israel's actions have left it at the verbal level. There has been no active opposition to these Israeli initiatives. And so Israel has kind of become the stalking horse for literally dismantling the international system. And of course, presenting this as Israel acting to save humanity and civilization and whatnot. But the fact that it has been able to do all of these things, not only get away with it from its sponsors and enablers in the West, but even the UN and its leadership itself have been so extraordinarily timid and standing up to Israel. I think that's an important part of the explanation of how we got to where we are today.
And much of this is happening as Israel expands, escalates its war in the region. And in support of that, Germany has said that it will continue to supply Israel with weapons. I saw a report this morning which said that it was in the Bild actually. It said that German newspaper, and it said that there's a clause in the new weapons deal with Germany and Israel demanding that the weapons not be used for genocide, which seems an admission that Israel
Only
is
in
possibly,
Germany.
yeah, Israel is probably committing genocide. But be that as it may, and also the US sending 100 troops, um, in addition to missiles to stop any attack from Iran. So, which seems to suggest that um, Biden has given the green light to Netanyahu to strike the Iranians in a manner which would demand a response from the Iranians as well. And therefore, he has sent his troops and also missiles to protect Israel from any impending attack from the Iranians. So it seems like, we are entering a new phase where war looks to be imminent. And at the same time, the whole rules-based system is completely dismantling.
Very much so. Just regarding Germany, I mean, come on, I haven't seen this particular piece of news, but if it's indeed the case that Germany is basically sending a message to Israel, we know you're committing genocide. We support you. We have a record here, and when we said never again, what we really meant is let's do it again. But just one small request: please don't use our weapons. Use to
That's what it seems to be happening.
commit
It's
this crime
exactly
of
what's
crimes.
happening.
It's
Yes.
it's it's really incredible. That I have to say, um, the U.S. obviously has played the most destructive international role during the past year, but Germany is also, I think, in a class apart. Germany, which defines itself as a state with a mission to atone for its devastating destruction of not only Europe's Jews, but much of Europe as a whole during World War II, which is now so openly embracing genocide once again and pretending it's doing so as a way of atoning for its sins. I mean, it's, cognitive dissonance at a whole nother level. Regarding the US, there are two explanations for what the US is doing. One is that what's put forward about the Biden administration, that Biden personally believes that the best way to maintain influence over Israel is to ensure that there's no daylight between the US and Israel in public, and that by giving Israel everything that it asks for and then some, the U.S. will be able to influence the decisions Israel makes. Well, you've had, I'm not going to say decades, but let's just say 1 year of daily developments that prove this theory wrong. The other one, of course, is that the U.S., despite its constantly expressed opposition to a regional war, has now come around in the wake of Israel's initial successes against Hezbollah in terms of assassinating its general secretary and other leaders and so on, that Washington has now come around to the view that there is a real and perhaps unique opportunity to establish a new order in the Middle East, to change the strategic equation in the Middle East. And it is in this context that the U.S. is now sending not only these air defenses, but also once again putting its own soldiers in harm's way. It has, of course, already done so in the Red Sea, but now it's doing so directly in Israel, and they will be tasked with seeking to minimize the impact of any potential Iranian retaliation to, as you mentioned, what is widely anticipated to be an inevitable Israeli strike on Iran. So watch this space.
Hmm. I wanted to end on a question about why there is no daylight between the US and Israel, and touch on a story from last week regarding a person called Matt Brodsky. So he was a former White House advisor under the I think Obama administration, and he tweeted that the Israelis should carpet bomb, and I quote, carpet bomb the Irish peacekeepers in Lebanon. And he is one of many examples. Another was last year, someone by the name of Stuart Seldowitz, again, a former US State Department official who worked under Madeleine Albright. And Madeleine, many of our viewers would know, she's more famous than anything for defending the massacre of 500,000 Iraqis. When she was asked if it was worth it, killing 500,000 Iraqi children, she said, and I quote, yes, it was worth it. And the person leading the negotiation with Lebanon, Hezbollah, is a person by the name of Amos Hochstein. And he is a former Israeli soldier, and he's leading the negotiation with from the US side anyway. All of these individuals, Brodsky, Seldowitz, Albright, under Israel's law of return, they would all have the automatic right as Jews to migrate to not just Israel, they'd have the right to move to the illegally occupied territories in Palestine, and the Israeli government would give them subsidies to houses with swimming pools in the illegally occupied Palestinian territories. So when you look at it that way, is it no wonder why US policy and Israeli policy is no difference or between them, because the people who are making the policies, as I said, they are wedded to Israel in a way others aren't.
Yeah, I see it slightly differently. These individuals you're referring to, I think they influence policy. I don't think they make it. And I think the reason they're able to achieve such prominent positions in the U.S. foreign policy establishment is because they represent the values and the principles and the strategic priorities of the administration that recruited them. I mean, I've always felt in the U.S.-Israeli relationship, the U.S. dog is wagging the Israeli tail, and not the other way around. I think these very disturbing examples you give of this basically, KKK type racist. I can't remember his name, Seldowitz or something like that.
Yes,
And
Stuart Seldowitz.
yeah,
Mm.
and now this
Matt
Brodsky
Brodsky.
character. I mean, what it demonstrates is that people with such values um, are fully welcome in the U.S. foreign policy apparatus. having such attitudes is absolutely no bar to achieving senior positions in the U.S. foreign policy establishment. Of course, not all of them hold such values, but it certainly helps with career advancement if you do hold these very vulgar, racist attitudes towards Palestinians, towards Arabs, towards Muslims. It shows, you're one of us. You're one of the, you have what it takes. And having said that, I do agree. I mean, if you look at those who have been appointed, for example, as U.S. ambassadors to Israel, as part of what the U.S. likes to call the peace team, which is actually the annexation and impunity team, and these types of characters, they do tend to have to demonstrate an unconditional support for Israel as a prerequisite to being appointed. But again, they're being appointed by none other than the White House and the National Security Advisor. So they're part of the tail that has become part of the dog, if you will, rather than the other way around.
Thank you, Mouin. As ever, it's a privilege listening to your thoughts and analysis. Hope to speak to you again next week.
I
And
look
thank you
forward to
also.
it. Thank you.
Yes, me too. And thank you for tuning in. And see you next week for another review of the week with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Bye bye.